Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our session today, using imagery to empower and support families throughout their transplant journey. My name is Amanda Goldstein, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. My daughter Lily received a transplant in July 2016, so that's my connection. And now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing two of my favorite people, Dr. Ari Pollack, Assistant Professor of Pediatrics in Nephrology at Seattle Children's Hospital and the University of Washington School of Medicine, as well as Julia Dunbar, PhD candidate, Health Informatics and Human-Computer Interaction at the University of Washington's Information School. Now I'd like to have them start the session. They're going to be giving you opportunities to ask questions throughout, as well as towards the end. So please don't forget to put your questions in the chat function. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks everyone for having us today. We're really excited to share our work and get everyone's feedback and kind of, yeah, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Again, my name's Ari Pollack, and like Amanda said, I am a pediatric nephrologist at Seattle Children's Hospital and the University of Washington. In addition to seeing patients, I also do research, and my research focuses on how we can use technology to improve clinical decision-making for both clinicians and patients, and really starting to kind of think about how we can leverage technology to support collaborative decision-making, given my focus on working with adolescents and young adults and even younger kids, and making sure that their values and preferences are included in that decision-making process, and how we can use technology to support that. And now I'm going to let my colleague Julia introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. So I am a PhD candidate, as Amanda said, at University of Washington's Information School in Seattle, Washington. Although right now I'm actually in New Orleans at a different conference, so I am multi-conferencing right now, but it's really great to be here with you all. A little bit more about my research is, so I broadly do work, as Amanda said, kind of at the intersection of health informatics and human-computer interaction. A lot of my work kind of uses things that are known as qualitative or design methods, as well as participatory research methods, which we'll be describing kind of throughout this presentation. And my work broadly focuses on how technologies can empower and support pediatric patients with chronic illnesses to kind of take charge of their own care and to ultimately better communicate with their care team, such as their family, friends, and their hospital team, such as their clinicians. I'll hand it back over to Ari.
Great. Thanks, Julia. So Julie and I are going to be co-presenting today, and we're using an interesting software tool that allows us to co-present, even though we're in different sides of the country. So hopefully there won't be any hiccups because we've tested it, but I think it should be pretty cool. Anyways, and like Amanda said, we'd like this to be interactive. We do have some kind of opportunities within the presentation where folks can ask questions. So please do so. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. So overall, here's our agenda for today. We're going to give some background on the work that we're doing, and specifically kind of the project that has kind of inspired a lot of this work, as well as present the goals that we have for our presentation, and then go into some of the detailed methods and results from the work that we're doing, and like I said, provide lots of time for questions. So the project that we're going to talk about today is a project that I've been working on now for about 4 years, and actually just entering the 5th year of this project. This is a project that's funded through the NIH, specifically through the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases. And it's called I Know It, Increasing Knowledge in Pediatric Kidney Transplant Patients Through Information Technology. And the overall research goal of this project is to identify approaches where technology or health information technology can support self-management and reduce illness uncertainty by identifying the key information needs and visualization strategies required by young kidney transplant patients and their caregivers. And so that's kind of a lot of weird technical words, I find, but let me kind of go into a little bit more what we mean by this. And so this work kind of came about, like I said, about 4 or 5 years ago when we were, looking to how we can better support our transplant patients and families. And, I came up with this, or had this realization that for most people who've had a kidney transplant or any transplant, I think for that matter, is it's a very rare occurrence. And for many people, they don't have kind of experience in that area, and so the experiences that they go through either before, during, or after transplant are new and unique, and are foreign to them, for lack of a better word. And so this kind of leads to these kind of unmet information needs where they don't have the information to know whether or not their experiences are typical or atypical. um, and that these unmet needs kind of leads to something called illness uncertainty, where you really don't have the information you need to contextualize kind of the journey or the illness or the disease process that individuals are going through. And when you don't have that ability to kind of understand whether something is typical or expected, or if it's unexpected, it's really hard to engage in the self-management skills or do the things that people need to do to take care of themselves and to engage in their healthcare. And so when you don't have that information, it leads to this ineffective self-management, which ultimately can lead to poor outcomes. And so the framing of this project was, is can we help people recognize when if their experiences are like others who've also had a transplant, and to help them recognize when those experiences are different, and to once they can recognize that those differences or their experiences are atypical, can we help them get back on track so that they can have those better outcomes that we all want. And so the goal of today's presentation is to first kind of show the work that we've been doing in this research project, and think about how visually enabled methods are good for this type of work, and how these visually enabled methods can help people engage and in their own kind of post-transplant journeys, as well as help them contextualize those experiences. And then how we can leverage this imagery to support individuals gaining rich insights into their experiences, but also not just their own experiences, but help people gain insight into others' experiences, and how these images can help even support the communication with their clinicians and family members. And that's really what we hope to accomplish today. So I'm going to start with speaking about the first project that we've been doing. And this project is actually broken down into 3 different aims or chapters. And we're just going to talk about 2 of those today. And we're going to start with the first aim now. And the first aim is really where we characterize those information needs that reduce illness uncertainty, and that will support transplant self-management for patients and caregivers. And then the second aim is how we can utilize, or trying to figure out how we can visualize that information to support patients and families. And so like I said, we're going to start with this first aim here. And so when we think about kind of what are kind of those information needs, it really comes down to a couple questions that we asked ourselves. And that first one is how do patients and families describe their transplant journey? And again, thinking about this from the perspective of what's a normal or what's a typical journey for people as they go through this. And so we need to first, before we can kind of describe that, we need to understand, well, how are people describing their own journeys? And as we hear a lot of people tell those stories, can we kind of come up with some, or a list of common themes or challenges that people have? What are the highs and lows that people experience, and how have they overcome these challenges? And also, where do people find the strength to kind of, as they traverse through this journey? And then as we kind of get this description, is how can we develop methods to capture these transplant journeys and provide that opportunity for people to back on reflect back on those journeys so that we can reduce uncertainty. And so in this first aim, we basically took a qualitative approach to this work, and we developed two sets of semi-structured interviews with pediatric kidney transplant patients and their caregivers. And we utilized the method called photo elicitation. Excuse me. And I'm going to get into that in a second. But in these first interviews, we really tried to get an idea of this journey. In the first interview, we actually, when we were coming up with the protocol for this work, we actually used this first interview as kind of an icebreaker, where we wanted to make sure people understood our method. And it turns out that that icebreaker exercise was very enlightening for us, and I'll share some of that in a second. And so, like I said, we use something called photo elicitation, and so what is photo elicitation, and why did we choose a visually enabled approach? And so, photo elicitation is basically a qualitative method where images are used to prompt individuals to talk about their personal experiences and values. And it could be any image. It could be an image that somebody took with their own phone or camera, or it could be an image that somebody drew. It could be an image from a magazine or a book or a website or whatever. But really the goal here is to help use kind of the image to structure those interview questions. And we chose to use this visually enabled approach because we really wanted to engage our pediatric transplant recipients to help figure out ways to generate kind of these rich insights into their experiences. And our methods were interviewing kids as young as 7 years old, and we thought that perhaps using images was a really great way to get these younger kids to open up about their experiences. And not only did it work for the 7-year-olds, but it worked for our entire, all of our participants, and really gave us a really, really great rich insight, which I'm going to share with people right now. And so, like I said, the first interview was an icebreaker. And what we asked people was to just take 5 photographs and or to choose 5 photographs that tells their transplant story. And that was it. We didn't really provide any other context or any other guidance around that, and really left it open to our participants to decide what information or what stories they even wanted to share with people. And like I said, this was designed as an icebreaker to help make sure people understood the methods. But it was such a powerful experience, and we learned so much from these first interviews. And that second interview, which I'm going to let Julia share in a few minutes, was actually designed as the primary focus of our study. But like I said, this first interview was really, really great. And so in the first interview, we found these themes that came out of all the pictures, and we had about 30 participants participants who kind of contributed to this work. And after listening to their stories and looking at their photographs, we came up with these 4 themes that came out of this work. The first was sense making, where people would use these photographs to kind of or not just photographs, but as they went along their journeys, these were kind of the things that kind of came out, I should say. And so they sense making was the big component, where they were trying to figure out how to apply or use medical information in the context of everyday life. The second theme that we often saw our participants experience is that there's lots of barriers and obstacles that they would encounter, and these would this would lead to challenges with adherence or other challenges that would interfere with achieving their healthcare goals or health goals. We saw lots of examples of how the social interaction and community engagement would provide support to patients and families, and how it was really kind of this collective community event that would wrap around patients and families as they were going through their transplant journeys. And then lastly, this concept of transitions in agency, where for these young individuals, as they were learning how to become young adults, is becoming independent and competent in self-management and looking at the struggles and challenges that people had during that journey. And so I wanted to share some of the photographs that people presented to us or shared with us, because I think they're really powerful and I think they tell some great stories. So this first photograph I just find incredibly powerful, and this was submitted by a teenager who actually, this was a picture that he had taken on a trip that he had been on. He's from South Africa, but and just submitted this picture because he felt it encapsulated his journey. And I'm going to read the quote that he shared with me at the time. And he says this relates to his kidney transplant. And he wanted us to focus on the fact that the light in the foreground is out, because it's like there isn't anything, nobody really guides you. And that was my interpretation. That's just one of the things for me. But there's nothing like when I'm in school, there won't be anything that will guide you after a kidney transplant. And so he kind of felt kind of alone as he's trying to navigate how does he deal with this kidney transplant. He didn't feel like there was anybody guiding him, and he felt like he was surrounded by darkness in this world of this kind of light and kind of rich scenery, but he kind of felt that he was alone. And I just found that really interesting. And that, in contrast with this photograph that was submitted by a parent, reflecting on kind of their experience where their child had been transplanted many years previous. And this is their quote: "I think I'm in awe almost every day of just normal stuff that he does. He goes to school and he can run around and things that when I was pregnant, we were like, will he be able to do any of this? There were so many questions. And so, I mean, it's still sort of mind blowing to think that he's got a transplanted kidney in there. So it's like, how could I?" So this is one random picture of something normal. He puts on his backpack and he goes to school every day. He's just a normal kid in that sense. So even though we have all this other stuff, like a big part of my experience is just like constantly, I can't even believe. It just kind of blows my mind, just normal kid stuff that he's able to do. And really, that's what we're trying to figure out here, is how do we support that? And I think it's great to kind of see these two pictures bookended against each other, because they show that the challenges of people trying to get to that state of normalcy and how kids are resilient and people are resilient in this process. So I'm going to show you, this is the next picture of some of the barriers and obstacles that we identified. And this is a picture of expired medications. And this family, and we heard this from a variety of families, that a lot of people kept their medications despite that they were expired. And their quote was, because they're scared, or I'm scared that there's going to be an earthquake and we won't be able to get refills on our medications. And the earthquake's going to happen right when we have to order, or right when we have an order coming, and trucks aren't going to be able to come to the house. So we're not going to be able to get our medications. Here's another challenge and barrier that people experience. And here's a slide, a photograph, and this is what the mom had to say about this for her young son, who also was born with kidney disease. You know, how all the other normal kid things become magnified. His tooth didn't break because he got hit really hard. His tooth broke because the enamel on his teeth are different because of his meds, because of his medical history, because of all of that. So it's how these are those little things, those are hard. Those are the things that make me sad, because it's just like it's that much harder for him. So thinking about kind of moving past those barriers and obstacles, well, how are people kind of transitioning? What are the stories that people have about those transitions and agency? And here's a picture of somebody doing home tacrolimus testing, where they would do, poke their finger and they would put a drop on a card and they would send it to us, and we'd be able to do those timed tacrolimus testing so that they don't have to go to the lab at 7:30 in the morning before their tacrolimus medication is due. But this was an interesting quote from one of our teens who said, "Because I'm not sick anymore, I can do things by myself and I don't need to be watched all the time." That's the one thing I hate about school, is that there's teachers help in some classes and they always feel they need to watch me personally. And I just hate that, you know? It just bothers me because I can do things by myself and yet they don't seem to understand that. And that was such a common theme that we had between both our parents and caregivers and our youth participants, is that tension between that, how much or how independent are they and how capable are they in being able to take care of their needs. And it's a challenge that I think we all experience, and it's really interesting to see that kind of come through in these photographs. And then lastly, this concept of community. And here's a picture of one of our participants' medications on their dining room table. And their quote is, "Next to the eating area is our computer desk." And there's a lot that happens there: homework, family meals. I would say we're together the most in that area of the house. And there's accountability with that too, because everyone knows where her pillbox is, and it's in an area where we are a frequent team. So other people can look at it and see it's not tucked away somewhere. It's where you can see the pills are still in there or not. And this leads to the last picture of the fact that that transplants don't just impact the individual, as everybody knows, that it really impacts the family and impacts the community. And this quote and this picture represents that so well. And the quote from one of our participants said, "When a child is diagnosed with kidney failure, I mean, it doesn't just affect that child, it affects the patient, the parents, the siblings, everybody. It doesn't just, it's not just his life unless he was an only child, but it would still affect the parents involved in that. We have a whole group, you know, we have 4 people in our family and even a grandchild. So yeah, it's just a family thing." And I think this was so powerful, seeing all these pictures and hearing these stories. And it really helped us to kind of see, get some insight, early insight into the power that images can have in helping people think back about their own experiences and think about how it helped me as a clinician gain more insight into our family's experiences. And when we ask people to think back about this experience and participating in this project, they saw so much value in these photographs as a self-reflection tool. And they also wanted to share these pictures with their clinicians so that their clinicians could see them outside of the hospital setting and get insight into their life and see them as these individuals that are that have that are part of their life is kidney disease, but that is not who they are. And so we see the value in these photographs, and so we hope that we can share with others that there's this potentially incredibly powerful tool in photo elicitation, and how it created this rich set of experiences. And we are now looking at ways how we can start to incorporate kind of photo elicitation into the clinical setting, or even just into people's lives, where they can, you know, to help with self-reflection, help with potentially clinician empathy, and really improve self-management. And so I'm going to kind of pause there and see if there's any questions kind of before we go on to the next section. And it's okay if there aren't any questions.
Actually, I was just going to say, I think the photos are incredibly powerful, and I was just chatting with our tech Zoe that I'm tearing up because as a parent, you know, to see the backpack, you know, that positive, but you know, juxtapose, you know, in reverse, to see the light and how that individual felt so alone. So, I mean, incredibly powerful to share those images. And of course, of all the medications, and living in an area in the East Coast that we don't have earthquakes, it never would occur to me that another family has to stockpile just in case that they can't get the meds that they need. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I I think the photographs are powerful, but the stories accompanying the photographs are also what's powerful. And I'm so thankful for our participants who are willing to share these with us. So
If there are any questions from our group, please feel free to put them in the chat. We could just wait a couple of seconds because I know it's a lot to take in.
Yeah, and I apologize for not kind of preparing people ahead of time for sharing these photographs, because I know they can be emotional and can generate strong emotions for people. And so I appreciate you listening to us and kind of processing those emotions as we're sharing things here. So,
right. You didn't warn us that we would need tissues before coming to this session.
So Amanda, I think we're going to keep going then if nobody has any.
No questions at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to switch over to Julia now.
Yeah, let's see if this technology will work for us. Sorry if anyone heard any knocks in the background. Like I mentioned before, I'm actually at another conference in a hotel room. So I'm going to be discussing interview 2, and this is actually where I came in the project. I guess it's been about a few years now, and it's been really amazing to experience this work with Ari, as he's mentioned several times. So as a quick reminder, interview 1 was kind of that icebreaker activity, and where we really discovered the power of photo elicitation and the different stories that come out of sharing those different photos and their lived experiences. But for interview 2, what that focus was is we also used photo elicitation, but is more specifically focused on 4 specific topics of worry, confidence, feeling similar, or feeling different. So these topics were actually decided prior because we thought that they would help kind of us and the participants to mainly us to capture these kind of key stories and elements and photos that we've been showing you all, mainly about the certainty as well as the uncertainty associated with the overall transplant journey. And the next slide, I'm actually going to discuss a framework that came out of and that was developed based on the findings from the second interview. Alrighty, so here we have this framework. I know it's kind of a lot all in one slide, so I'm going to break it down for us a little bit. So as I mentioned, this framework was developed based on the findings from the second interview. So we have been calling this framework the kidney identity framework. This name might actually change a little bit because we've heard from some participants they might prefer a different name, such as kidney transplant journey. So we're still noodling with that a little bit. But overall, this framework shows kind of the different changes throughout the transplant journey from diagnosis to after transplantation. And what I mean by this is we have a flower here. And each petal in this flower kind of shows different, what we're calling tensions, because these tensions as kind of shift potentially from positive to negative throughout different points of that transplant journey. And each of these different tensions are, we have the first one here kind of exchanging information on over there on the right hand side, and then we also have managing transitions, building confidence, telling my story, and normalizing the journey. So interestingly, like I've mentioned, the fluctuation isn't always unidirectional with participants, and it kind of consistently changes throughout the transplant journey based on kind of different both clinical and non-clinical factors. And I'm actually on the next few slides going to also provide some quotes from participants. And the first one is going to be around that managing transitions. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that specific petal that we have here. So for managing transitions, we see this kind of fluctuation, and for that fluctuation on one side we have this family management, which as Ari kind of described previously in some of the other ones from interview 1, is that this process and this journey is really a family's journey throughout most of the time. But as these youth as they age and grow older, they want to learn how to start to self-manage. So we have this kind of fluctuation and kind of 2 sides of this spectrum throughout parts of the kidney transplant journey. And then another one of our quotes after that is going to be around telling your story. So as people kind of experience different parts of their kidney transplant journey, they experience kind of this fluctuation of wanting people to know and have this self-expression and acceptance almost around what's happened with them and their kidneys in their kidney transplant journey. But at other times they may feel a little bit more like hiding this and keeping it a little more to themselves as they kind of work through different parts of their journey. So on our next slide, like I mentioned, I'll be talking about that managing transitions. So here's a quote we have from a participant. So they say, it's the whole family because it doesn't just affect me and T3. It affects everybody in the family. T3 is really, really good about it, and it's not just him and me. The whole family's involved. His brother is a big part of it because T3 can't actually hear very well. He can't hear the alarms, so he has to rely on somebody else to help him. So as this participant describes, it's really a whole family endeavor behind all of it. But this might kind of change throughout parts of the journey, as I mentioned. So we're going to have a look at a quote from that other side of the spectrum. So we have here a quote, whoops, sorry about that. We have a quote about self-management. And for that quote, it says, over time, there we go. We have, sorry, it says, really just making sure I have medicines with me, even if I'm only going out for a little bit, just to hear like, hey, I want to hang out more. So I have my meds with me. I have water with me. So this participant was an adolescent, and as they kind of gotten older, they want to have these opportunities to hang out with their friends, but they realize that they can't just kind of go out and hang with friends. So they have to kind of think through some of these different things and learn how to self-manage a little bit more by bringing water with them, making sure they have their meds with them. And then our next quote example is about telling your story. And for this one, this quote I actually is a little bit in between. It's not on one side of the spectrum or on the other side. It's really kind of them describing that transition from hiding to self-expression. So they say, over time, I just kind of ignored it. I didn't really care what people thought of me. If I was different, I still don't really care if people think I'm different. It's just kind of a thing over time when you're just like, you're different, get over it. Back when I had the kidney transplant, it made me feel really bad because my body just wasn't normal, you know? I got over it. So this participant kind of describes that it took some time, but with that time, they kind of went from realizing that they had their different version of normal and they may be a little uncertain about parts of their kidney transplant journey, particularly after the kidney transplant. But with time, they kind of, as they say, got over it. But for our next slide, we're going to be talking about kind of the next steps after interview 2. So here I have some questions about what we're looking to address with our next steps. So we're looking to see if this overall kidney identity framework that I showed you all today accurately actually captures these different tensions and transitions that occur, and what other tensions, if any, do kidney transplant recipients and their caregivers feel should be added to this kidney identity framework. So beyond that, though, we're also starting to think, how can we actually start to visualize these tensions and changes throughout that kidney transplant journey? So as Ari kind of described in that AIM 2, we're kind of going from a little bit into that, where we're looking to see how can we kind of go from using this photo elicitation method to now starting to visualize some of these different things for people. So in the next few slides, I'll be showing you actually one of the examples that we gave to people in our interview 2 next steps and what they've kind of described and how they felt about that. So this is the visual we created. So we actually created 3 different initial kidney identity visuals to illustrate the tensions and shift changes throughout the post-kidney transplant journey. So on the kind of left-hand side, you can see those different overarching categories that we had, or those 5 different tensions. But then you can see the kind of spectrums of the tension highlighted by red and green. And this is particularly for 1 month after transplant. And you might say that throughout different parts of the transplant journey, a recipient may shift or adjust these sliders. So, and I'll kind of show you how that'll end up looking. And within the first month after transplant, recipients might be leaning a little bit more towards, as it shows here, a little bit more negative sides of their tensions due to the different kind of uncertainties they may be feeling, along with the feeling of not feeling their normal self quite yet and adjusting to their post-transplant body. And maybe that's kind of other different worries about missing school and so on and so forth. But then you might see a little shift or change when it comes to 6 months after transplant. So when you see this after 6 months after transplant, the sliders may fluctuate a little bit. And so if you can see that, sorry, my bad, advanced a little too quickly there. And after, let me go back here for you. Is this working? There we go. And sorry about that, still getting used to this new technology here. And as they become, they might shift more towards that positive, and as that uncertainty kind of dies down and they start to feel their version of normal again, which can be affected by kind of these different clinical and non-clinical factors. And then on the next few coming slides, what you're going to see is actually how they may view this over the entire post-kidney transplant journey and maybe some other added elements to it. So now we see here that we kind of, the visual will be showing, like I said, those kind of different components of that kidney transplant journey and how it may change and shift. So we may have that kind of start right at transplant, then we might go 1 month into that transplant. And as you can see on the little sliders, imagine if a participant was actually using this, they would adjust those sliders slightly depending on how they feel after 1 month. But then they might go up to 6 months post-transplant, and as you can see, it shifts again. So as I described previously, at 6 months, they might be feeling a little less uncertainty and a little bit more towards that version of their normal self. And then we have 1 year post-transplant. And for that 1 year post-transplant, their slider will become even a little different. So a participant might be filling it out. They might feel definitely more confident and a little less worried. And we start to add in these kind of other elements where participants would want to express how they actually feel versus just having this slider. And a participant might see their overall timeline here, and they might want to remember kind of more specific parts about it. So they might be able to kind of hover over this 1 year mark where they then can look at the 5 different tensions they filled out, along with the ability to maybe look at a photo and potentially even a quote about their experience during that time. Such as you can see here a little bit, and hopefully advanced forward. Just double checking. There we go. And as you can see here, we have a photo of our participant along with a quote. So this is what they might see from their view. So, and now that you kind of see this whole picture, you can see how a participant, as they're kind of going through the kidney transplant, they may want to have this self-reflection around their overall kidney transplant journey. And because of that, they would be able to view this timeline, see each of the different moments of it, but then maybe have these added elements of bringing those photos back into play so that they can show what they were having for their lived experiences at that time. Alrighty, so these are kind of our overall conclusions and takeaways from AIM-1 overall. So not just the first interview, but also the second interview was, as already described, the kind of overall success of really using these visually enabled methods and how it really allowed participants and as researchers for us to really see these lived experiences along with, as well as the stories that go along with them. And because of this, have some really rich content for analysis. And then it also gave participants the ability to connect with and show us aspects of all of their lived experiences in different parts. And then we ultimately have the potential, as those last few slides show you, for using visuals to help patients break down their kidney transplant journeys. And then I'm going to pause here a little bit to see if anyone has any questions about interview 2 or kind of AIM-1 overall.
It looks like, Julia, no questions right now in the chat. But...
Yeah, exactly. No questions so far.
Okay. Well, I guess we can just move on to the next part then. And if any come up, feel free to kind of pause us, Amanda. And then for our next part, we're going to be going into our second AIM. So we have, like I said, that first one, and then Here will be the second one coming up. And as a quick reminder, so aim 2 was to kind of determine these appropriate methods for ultimately kind of organizing and visualizing information to address these information needs that we found from our first aim, and ultimately reduce illness uncertainty and hopefully support some self-management. And for aim 2, we had our different objectives, and we kind of have how can images be used to ultimately help patients and families understand their kidney transplant journey, as well as how can images help build connections with other transplant patients and their families. So we transitioned from using this photo elicitation as a method, but to ultimately creating some visuals so patients and families can understand their transplant journeys as well as build these connections. So for aim 2, we had a bit of a different approach. So for aim 1, as we said several times now, we had the photo elicitation, but for aim 2, we're focusing on what's called user-centered design, and we actually broke this down into a series of different design sessions. I'm going to discuss all these a bit more in detail on the next few slides for you all. So you may be wondering, well, what is user-centered design and why did we choose to use this approach? And then ultimately, what were some of these different techniques we chose to use for each of these different design sessions? So what user-centered design is it's ultimately an iterative design process that focuses on the users and their needs throughout the process. And what I mean by it's an iterative design process is we don't kind of just have one idea and then stick with that throughout the whole time. It might shift and change a little bit, and we're consistently iterating on the different ideas with the users and their needs in mind, as well as typically these design and research teams involve users throughout this process, which is something we did. So we actually had those series of design sessions, like I mentioned, and that's where we brought in users to kind of help us throughout our process and with a variety of different research and design techniques. So ultimately, why did we choose this approach? So like we've said several times throughout now is our primary focus is the user. In this case, the user are these youth participants, pediatric transplant recipients and their caregivers. And we want to involve them both throughout the entire process and have the final outcome ultimately be geared with their values in mind. So that user component is particularly important to us in this work. And then what techniques did we choose to use for each session? So I'm going to break that down a little bit because I'm going to be showing you some of the findings from each of these on the next few slides. So for design session 1, we had what first is kind of like a focus group along with lightning talks. So for design session, just for overall to give you a little more background on this is we had groups of caregivers as well as youth pediatric kidney transplant recipients, and they ultimately completed all the same activities or design sessions, but they did so in their own groups. So we had caregivers in their own Zoom session, and then we had pediatric patients in their own Zoom session. So they had the opportunity to kind of connect with, which was actually a big component in several of these sessions, because with this population, as Ari stated, is they don't often have the ability to connect with other pediatric patients who are going through the same experiences as them. And for our two different groups, we had kind of an older group of youth and a younger group of youth. In the younger group, we had 3 pairs, ages 10 to 12, and everyone was post-transplant 6 months out. And for the older group, we had 5 pairs in both the youth participant group and the caregiver group, and their ages were 15 to 19. So for design session 1, what we had people do is ultimately have some discussions, but we structured these discussions around what we call a lightning talk. So we had people create some slide decks, and in their slide decks, we asked them to do different things such as introduce themselves to the group. We had them describe what they want other transplant kind of kids or caregivers to know about them. And then we also asked them to, which was the primary focus, to create questions that they had for other kids as well as caregivers, and and then we also had them come up with questions that they were interested in asking clinicians. And I'll be showing you some of those on the next slide. But before I do so, I want to describe really quick design session 2. So this was actually a series of design tasks where we had people do a bunch of different things, such as grab different objects around their house that meant something to them and meant something to their kidney transplant experience. We had them drawing ideas, and then we ultimately had them do a group drawing at the end, which I'll be showing examples of. And these tasks focused on different topics around their kidney transplant journey, such as normalcy, adherence, taking medications on time, and clinical and lab results. And then for design session 3, we did one-on-one interviews with everyone, and Ari will be describing that a little bit more detail, but from the second design session, we had people create these amazing visuals, which we took their inspiration from that, and then we created some of our own visuals. And Ari will be showing you a really amazing demo about some of that. But like I mentioned, I'm going to show you some of our findings from the first design session. So for the first design session, we had some of these initial findings, which were, what are these kind of questions that youth have that they want to ask other youth participants, as well as what are some of the questions caregivers have that they want to ask other caregivers, and ultimately, what are some questions they all have for clinicians? So as you can see here on the top, this is from the younger group. And for the first question for the younger group, this was what question one participant had for other youth participants. So they asked, what was your reaction when you got the call about your kidney? So they were kind of curious and really seeing, how did you feel? Was it overwhelming? Was it underwhelming? And what were the different experiences and emotions you felt at that time? But then the younger group also had questions for clinicians. So they wanted to kind of know, how do you decide when someone is ready for a transplant? How does that decision get made, and why is it made? And then we had our caregivers who had a different set of questions that they had for other caregivers. And our caregivers were wondering from other caregivers, what has been the best or most positive thing about your child having a transplant? And then from this, they kind of wanted to ultimately see, hey, we know this transplant can be a really tumultuous kind of experience, but what were some of the things that came out of it that were really positive? And then they also had their questions for the clinicians, such as they had questions about how can you prepare patients and caregivers for the care that will be required after surgery. And then, like I said, this is all from our younger group, and I wanted to give you all some examples from our older group as well, because it was kind of interesting to compare the younger to older groups, because they had some different themes that you'll see on the next slide around the questions they asked. So for our older group, in the same kind of order here, one of our older group participants asked the other older youth, how has your experience in all aspects of life changed before and after your transplant? So this youth participant was really curious kind of about, well, we know there's kind of these medical components, but how have these maybe affected other parts of your life? And how has that ultimately kind of discussed or made up your entire life experience? And then they had questions for their clinicians, such as, one question I have is, why does a deceased donor kidney last shorter than a living donor kidney? And as you can see, these questions are a little different. They're maybe a little more complex in some ways, but they still get a lot of these same points across that the younger groups had as well. And then for our third question we have here, this one is from an older group caregiver. So they were asking, what things have you done that has helped your child transition well to adult care? So this wasn't as much of a priority in our younger group, right? Because the youth are still a little younger, but the older group and their caregivers are starting to really wonder, well, how can we transition to them being a little more self-management focused and a little bit more focused on their adult care? and their experiences. And then also from our older group, we had questions for clinicians, such as the one last question we have here, which is about college life. So like, what is the effect of lack of sleep and alcohol while taking immunosuppressive drugs? So as you can see here, these questions have really kind of shifted in some of the themes that were asked because of the age differences between that younger and older group.
Hey,
And then,
Julia, I just
yeah,
wanted to let you know that have about 10 minutes or 7 minutes left, so we gotta start
okay.
wrapping things up.
Yeah, so I'll go really quickly through I'll just show one of our examples from our second design session. So for our second design session, which informed our third design session visual that Ari will be demoing, this is one from the younger group. And for that group drawing, this one talked about things that when we asked them to kind of quantify the level of distractions they may experience while taking their medications, this was a group drawing that the youth came up with, and the youth ultimately stated that in a daily person's life who's been through a kidney transplant, there's at least 4 distractions while living with a kidney transplant. So on average, the number average for these transplant patients is 6. But if they have less distractions, their number might be closer to an 8 or 9, with the ultimate goal of being a 10. And then they included some of their different ideas of things that kind of helped them be less distracted, such as their alarms, their parents, or things that might cause a little bit more distractions. But ultimately, they focused on what are some things that helped their distractions. So I'm going to move through the next one, and then I'll switch it over to Ari to kind of focus on that third design session and what came out of that.
Great. Thanks, Julia. So just really quickly, I want to kind of bring everything together and think about how we might be able to apply these visuals or all these methods into a tool that potentially families could use. And I know there was a question from Joseph that asked, what is the main tangible change in the outcomes we saw from this work? And right now this work is really design focused and we haven't implemented anything yet. And that's what the final phase of this work will be. And so that's a great question. And I think our hope is that there will be an impact, but right now it's all about kind of figuring out how do we make something that potentially could have an impact. So I'm going to just really quickly go through this potential prototype of a tool that we could envision. And it's something called Faces of Normalcy. And it's really kind of one of the things that we propose or that we evaluated with people who got a lot of great feedback. And so you can imagine you have an iPhone app or an app that asks you each day, how are you feeling? And you could quickly kind of just, capture that along the spectrum. And so you capture that today. And with that, I want to take a photograph where I can capture a selfie that kind of records that feeling for the day. And then, I'm curious to see, well, how have I been feeling over the past month? And so I can look, over the past month, I've had mostly good days, but some days that are not quite as good. And comparing that to kind of over the past 6 months, I've struggled more kind of in the past 6 months, but more recently things are better. But I can kind of see an idea of where I've kind of been over this time and get some ideas. And I could also even go back and look at the photographs that are or pictures that I've taken. And, here are the pictures where I've been, feeling good about myself, having good days and kind of feeling like I have a well-established routine in comparison to days that I haven't been feeling as confident or things just feel like everything is going wrong. There. And then, sorry. And then also, but in addition to kind of just capturing those static kind of occurrences, so I'm more interested in also seeing how have I changed over time, or how have my feelings of kind of my state of normalcy changed over time. And you can see after the first week of transplant, things were really hard, but after 6 months, things definitely got better. And over the next 6 months, I had some challenges with things, whether challenges with friends or meds or labs or whatever, but I can capture that and see that over time. And perhaps we don't have a demo of that, but we could see the photographs that are associated with that. And the other thing that we're really trying to support with this tool is, how do I compare to others? And you can see that for others, that first week after transplant, most people are really struggling as well. But if we compare that to a year after transplant, most people are doing really better. But what's more important here is, let's say I want to compare that to people who are more similar to me. So if I'm a teen who plays sports and works and feels like my kidney is doing okay, maybe not perfect, but okay, and that I have to do everything myself. I'm curious to see, how do those people do? And so perhaps you could filter this and see that, yeah, people like me are struggling a little bit more than kind of those than others who don't maybe have those constraints. And also capturing those and seeing those photographs as well, and hearing those stories and seeing those stories, we think potentially could be very powerful. And so that's this kind of idea of this kind of Faces of Normalcy app, where we allow people to capture their feelings and experiences through imagery, allow reflection back on those items, and really support not just that reflection, but comparison to others, which we think is critical context to help calibrate one's experience and reduce uncertainty. And so we hope kind of throughout this presentation, we've been able to show the power of imagery and reflection, and through kind of these kind of different elements of our project, how these can really support new insights for patients, families, and clinicians, and how we can explore these tools can be integrated both into clinical and non-clinical settings. And ultimately, the goal is to provide additional support to patients and families, so that we can get the best possible and most desirable outcomes. And so, sorry for rushing at the last few minutes there, but kind of wanted to thank everybody for their attention and participation, and that we're happy to answer any questions.
I just want to jump in and thank Dr. Pollack and soon to be Dr. Dunbar down the road, and for this wonderful, wonderful talk. I know that I learned a lot, and I'm so glad that you shared this incredible information. I know that we have some questions, and I'm wondering maybe if we can work on those offline and share those post-conference, the answer to those post-conference, because we're at 2:58 and I want people to be able to jump into their next session. So with that, I'll forward you the questions. And again, thank you so much to everybody who participated today, and to Dr. Pollack and Julia. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks again for having us. We really appreciate it.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you.